Let's talk about the Responsible Business Initiative. Even though voters backed it by a narrow majority, it failed to win support in a majority of Swiss cantons as required. How do you feel about the results?
I feel devastated. For the last 15 years, I have been thinking about responsible business. I have been working with the Swiss Amnesty International Business and Human Rights Group with Daniel Gostelli-Hauser, the head of that group, talking to companies, trying to convince them to go beyond voluntary measures, and really thought that this vote was going to make the difference. So many people were behind the initiative. It wasn't just human rights groups, although they were all there. It was also people coming from the responsible investment area, such as Ethos. You had all the churches who were in agreement, and a huge number of people voted. There were 50.7% of the popular vote went in favor of the initiative. So I was extremely disappointed. I felt that the initiative had a really good chance of passing, but in addition, I felt it was something that would have been good for Swiss business and good for Switzerland.
What would have been the main achievements if the initiative had passed?
Well, first of all, I think this would have been a great achievement for Switzerland itself and for Swiss companies, because Swiss companies would have understood exactly what they have to do. They would know that they had to put in place their due diligence on their supply chains. They would know that those steps would ensure, if they had to come back into the Swiss courts, they would be able to prove that they had done what was necessary. For me, that would have been a great advantage. In today's world, companies are moving all over the world into different legal systems, and they don't know what's waiting for them. If a Swiss company ends up in a court in the United States of America, they can find themselves in deep trouble if there are problems with their supply chains. In countries like the USA, you have punitive damages, you have juries who make decisions on the amount that the damages should be, and it's very complicated. You have to go from one country to another, and you don't know what's waiting for you. If the initiative had passed, Swiss companies would have known exactly what to do. They would have known what was expected of them, and they could have put that in place.
What would have been the main achievements if the initiative had passed?
Well, first of all, I think it would have been very clear for the Swiss government and for Swiss businesses exactly what is expected of them. Swiss companies would know that they had to put in place their due diligence in relation to their subsidiaries over whom they have control. They would know that the voluntary initiatives they have do not go far enough, but they would have legal certainty in relation to what they have to do. They would find that they were in line with legislation which has already been put into place, for example, in countries like France, where you have the law on vigilance. And they would have been ready for the legislation which is on its way from the European Union. In fact, just today, the European Council decided to approve the recommendations coming from the Commission and the Parliament in relation to future due diligence legislation for European companies. So for Switzerland, who is not in the European Union, but is definitely very affected by everything that happens with our neighbours, it would have meant they were in line with the legislation that's going ahead already. And in fact, if you look at one of our neighbours in Germany, the German government has already said that if the companies have not put in place their due diligence, they are going to put that in place themselves this year. So as far as I'm concerned, the Swiss companies would have been ready for what's coming, and they would have, in fact, have been able to control what happens to them, because it would be the Swiss courts who would make the decisions in relation to the human rights violations.
How can we protect human rights in our activities in third countries?
That's a very complicated question. And I must say, I understand very clearly that it's not easy for Swiss companies who do business all over the world, who have extremely long supply chains, who are not exactly sure what's happening in certain countries. Don't get me wrong, I understand that that's very complicated. But if we want to protect our company, our reputation, and the reputation of Switzerland, we have, in any case, There's a total need to put in place our due diligence, whether or not this is imposed by the law. Now, I think it's very interesting for companies here in Switzerland, particularly for big companies with long supply chains, to have the correct partners who might be able to help them to understand how they should work in different countries. And there are groups such as Shift, Verite. There are many different groups that can help companies in these sorts of situations. And I also would probably like to mention the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, because that is already looking at a number of big companies, looking at what they say they're doing in relation to their supply chains, in relation to how they work overseas, but also pointing out where there are lacks. Now, I recently listened to a discussion from Trinity College Dublin Centre of Social Innovation, because they have just brought out a study about Irish companies. And as you know, in Ireland, we have a lot of American companies as well. So they were looking at the biggest Irish and American companies that work outside Ireland. And they used the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark in order to help them to understand how they could better control their supply chains. And I would like to say, and particularly in relation to what happened here in Switzerland last weekend and my disappointment, particularly with the actions of the Swiss government, but also with the actions of some of the larger Swiss companies we have here. In contrast, the representative of the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland basically said that they were aware that there was legislation coming from the European Union, that they understood there was a need for a coherent approach within Irish companies, but also within all the companies in the European Union, and they welcomed what was happening and what was coming from the European Union. And this is in a huge contrast to what we saw here last week in Switzerland.
Is this the end, as the initiative didn't pass?
No, of course it's not the end. In fact, I think it really is just the very beginning. I think the time it's taken for this campaign to come through, don't forget, it started a number of years ago, has allowed people to begin to understand the complexity of what we were voting on. I think people began to understand much better how what was happening in other countries should impact them as people, because they were making a moral choice too. I think a lot of young people followed this discussion, and from my discussions with many young people, they voted probably for the first time. And don't forget, of course, we've also had the impact of the work that's been done by Greta Thunberg and all the awareness that has been built up in relation to climate change, because everything is linked. The work of multinational corporations, of course, has had an impact on the climate and globalization. The pandemic we're living today also has impacted the situation. So for me, it's just a beginning. And I think the companies who are not in favor of this may find it hard to prove their credibility in the future. For those of you who are following the election in Switzerland, you may know 73% of the people in Vevey, where one of our largest multinational is located, voted for the Responsible Business Initiative. If I were a member of a company, or if I was the CEO of a company, I would pay heed. In today's world, it's extremely important that people trust you. It's important that young people want to work with you. No, it's not the beginning. It's not the end. This is the very beginning, I think, of a new awareness of the responsibilities that companies have to take.
So what's next?
That's a really good question, because for those of you who live in Switzerland and who voted, you will understand that very little detail was given by the government in relation to what was going to happen next. So I'm a little bit, I'm waiting to see what the government is going to do. But personally, they said, as far as I understand, the non-financial reporting, which has already gone ahead in the European Union, will begin here in Switzerland. So in other words, companies will have to say what they're doing, both in terms of their human rights and in relation to the environment. So that will go ahead. So it won't be enough just to put in place glossy brochures telling the public what you're doing or what your CSO report is. But my big question is, how are the government going to control that? And if in relation to the banking world here in Switzerland, we had to put in place a FINMA in order to ensure that we didn't have the same problems as had taken place before, I am absolutely sure it will be necessary to put in place some kind of supervisory authority to really follow what the companies are doing here, because otherwise there's absolutely no way of knowing. So for me, that's going to make a big difference. In addition to that, what's next? Well, I don't believe the people who have now understood the problems that they are somehow a part of will accept and follow the government in everything that they suggest in the future. I think there are a lot of people now watching to see what's going to happen in terms of real supervision of Swiss companies. Before this discussion began in Switzerland, when we talked about the regulation of multinational corporations, the Swiss government always, pointed out that we already had the national contact points here in Switzerland. Now, the national contact points, in the main part, are something no Swiss person had any idea about unless you were really involved in this area. The national contact points have set in place a system whereby if somebody feels their rights were violated by a Swiss company, they can come into Switzerland thanks to the national contact points, which are coming from the OECD, and they can make a complaint. The problem in Switzerland, in my opinion, is the national contact points are housed in SECO, in the Department of the Economy, which means it's not exactly a neutral place. In other countries, there's been a lot of discussion as to where national contact points should be housed. I've seen, for example, I think it was in Denmark, it's a completely independent body who is watching what's happening, and when complaints are made by victims of human rights violations in relation to Danish companies, this particular body looks at it. So if in the future we're once again talking about the national contact points, a big discussion is necessary in relation to the independence of that body.
The accountants were not in favor.
Well, I've lived in Switzerland a long time now, over 30 years, and I was here back in 1992 when we had the same discussion in relation to Switzerland becoming part of the European Economic Area. And the discussion was very similar. I think Switzerland is a very complex place. We have a federal system. We have citizens who live in cities. We have people who live on the countryside. We have people in different nationalities in different parts of Switzerland. And I think it's very interesting, rather than saying why the cantons were against it, it's interesting to see which cantons were for it, because we should never forget that 50.7% of the population voted in favor of this particular initiative. The cantons in the Swiss-French area that were for it were in fact all of the cantons, Neuchâtel, Geneva, Fribourg, Vaud, and the only canton which voted in the opposite direction was Valais. And we must remember, and Swiss people will know this as well as I do, in Valais you have the Swiss-German part of Valais and you have the Swiss-French part of Valais. So Valais is in itself a very interesting canton. I think when you look at the cantons where the majority of the big corporations are located, most of these cantons voted in favor of the initiative. The canton of Zug, on the contrary, voted against it. So it's not a simple answer. There's no simple answer to that particular question. I do think perhaps, and that's my own personal opinion, I think it took a lot of people quite a while to understand that we were dealing with a change to the Swiss constitution. When the initiative was put forward at the very beginning, the original idea was to have a change to the constitution. And as time went along, a counter-proposal was suggested by a politician from the UDC party. And that counter-proposal, even though it didn't go as far as the initiative, would have requested that there be a change made to company law, where you wouldn't have needed a change to the constitution. The people who proposed the initiative were initially in favor of this, but it didn't manage to go through the government, through parliament. So we were back to the situation where you had to have a change to the constitution, which requires a double majority in Switzerland. A double majority in Switzerland is always very complex. This is still quite a conservative country. And in this particular case, it seems to me, a lot of the smaller cantons that actually don't have much contact with multinational corporations, but who listened to the government and who perhaps were fearful and made fearful. And I really do not approve of governments working on people's fear in order to stop progress, what I consider to be progress. So I hope I've answered the question, but I think between the complexity of Switzerland, the differences of languages, the difference between small cantons, big cantons, cantons in contact or not with business, I think we had a very complex situation to deal with here in Switzerland.
What could have been done differently?
Well, now that's a very, very interesting question, because I personally think the people who initiated this responsible business initiative, they did a fantastic job. The people who stood behind the proposals of the initiative did a fantastic job. You had the churches coming out and speaking up, which I personally feel is the role of people in churches. I believe that if we don't speak the truth and look for credibility, I think it's a real shame. There were over 450 citizens group who voluntarily set themselves up, went out in the streets, spoke to people, explained what the responsible business was all about. There were politicians from every side of the spectrum, from right to left and in the middle, who as people stood up and said what they felt needed to be done. There were business people, there were small businesses, there were big businesses who went in this direction. I feel it very hard to find how this could have been done differently. On the other hand, in relation to the people who were against the Responsible Business Initiative, I am really very disappointed. There are people that have disappointed me terribly, because I believe a lot of people acted because they were fearful. I think there were a lot of people who didn't really understand the content or the ideas. I felt, and this is something that I would probably, if I were teaching in my classes, I would probably say it's very important when you live in a country like Switzerland or Ireland, being Irish, that you look outside what's happening in your own country and you see what's happening in other countries, that you compare, that you don't always go forward without looking right or left. I think in Switzerland, sometimes we're inclined to look in an inward way. And I think that's not how we're going to find what the future needs or where the future must go. So what could have been done differently? I think perhaps we should be, and this is one of my thoughts very often, we should be teaching this in universities. We should be teaching this in schools. We should be giving information. Companies should be giving the training to their own people in order for this to change. And I think that if we did do this, things would change. I was horrified when I heard about a couple of very big corporations here in Switzerland writing to their own employees and telling them, more or less, how they should vote. I found that absolutely disgraceful. So, what could have been done differently? I think that human beings should stand up and be counted. We shouldn't allow politics or fear to force us to make decisions that afterwards we may regret, to make decisions where afterwards our children might say, where were you when the Responsible Business Initiative was voted on? What did you vote for? What were you looking for my future, for the future of our children? So I think I'll just stop there. But for me, it's all to do with ethics. It's all to do with a good moral behavior. It's all to do with thinking not just of ourselves, but thinking of the future and thinking of our children. Because our children need this. They need us to do the right thing.